Hi, I'm Harry Pickens, and we're here with three of the pioneers in the world of jazz education: Dr. David Baker, Mr. Jerry Coker, Mr. Jamey Aebersold. We're here this afternoon to talk a little bit about the beginnings of the jazz education movement and its impact on young people and people, musicians and people of all ages throughout the world. Welcome, gentlemen.
Glad to be here.
This is a really special and historic opportunity to have all three of you here, because I've known you for a number of years, and as a young musician trying to learn how to play the piano, I benefited tremendously from all of your materials and presence and so forth. And very often when we read books about jazz education or we hear about jazz education, the role of your work and of small combo jazz is not always covered a great deal. We learn a lot about big bands. We hear the Stan Kenton bands and the camps and so forth. But we're here today to talk a little bit about the hidden history, the invisible history of jazz education, specifically as it relates to small combo improvisation. So how did it all get started? How did this whole innovation of small combo jazz ed begin?
I think it began with the national stage band camps, which were primarily focused on big bands, but Jamey would sneak off at about 6 o'clock in the evening during the supper hour and take a large number of students with him and break them into combos and rehearse them sort of on the sly. It was not on the agenda, but he did it anyway, and I think that sort of opened the door to our thinking.
Now, where were these national stage band camps and when did they occur?
Started in 1959 at Indiana University with the Stan Kenton and Ken Morris. And at that time they had the Kenton Band in residence with a lot of, we won't tell them about the business with the tape recorder, but they had lots of people. I think 12, 13 bands across maybe the summers. I can remember Peter Erskine at 10 years old playing in the Oliver Nelson Big Band, which was the number one big band at the camp that year.
And it was called the Oliver Nelson Big Band because?
No, they were, these were assigned to people who led the bands. Oliver just happened to have the top band, and so he was in that band. Peter reminded me of that when I saw him over the
Oliver was one of the faculty members. These were only in the summertime. These are like, what, 2 weeks, 3?
Yeah.
What was it?
They ran about 3 weeks.
In different places, but it started out at IU, Indiana University in Bloomington, yeah. And then they kind of didn't they tack on a jazz festival 1 or 2 years there? With Allenberg and Cannonball?
Yes, I remember.
I don't think they ran combos, did they?
No, they were they were visiting people.
But it sort of added to the whole week long.
But the additional people usually at those early camps were the people from Berkeley, John LaPorta,
Herb
Pomeroy, Mussey,
Ray Santisi,
Jim Mosier.
Jim Mosier, yes.
Everett Longstreet.
Good, yes.
A lot of people, yeah, that I've forgotten.
Charlie Mariano, yeah. So in a lot of ways it was identified. I mean, I guess the educational component, as Ken Morris saw it, was to bring in the people, because then they stayed with us when we were going to Connecticut, when we were going to Massachusetts, virtually everywhere we went across those early years.
What was the approach to teaching jazz improvisation at that time, before there were the play-along records and the pedagogy books and all of that? What was different about it at that time?
Well, I just brought a book with me today that I gave to Jamey, that was written by David Gornston in 1934. That's 30 years before my first book, Improvising Jazz. And so it began, and David said there was one even earlier.
Well, it really wasn't a book so much. This is the Etude, which was the official magazine of MENC. And 1924, they did a complete book on the jazz, and they talked
1924.
They talked to everybody who was important in the not the jazz world, but in the world. Paul Whiteman was the only jazz man that they talked to at the time, and the people talked about the pernicious influence of jazz and how it caused miscarriages and that it shouldn't be taught, and that it had to be transmogrified many times over to be admitted into the Valhalla of good music. This was about the time of that picture you used to have, Jamey, of the swamp of jazz on the side of that goes up the mountain to Valhalla, and Beethoven and Brahms and Bach and the other people.
Jazz being a dangerous detour.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
The swamp of jazz it was called.
Yeah, Forest of Bad Music is at the bottom of that page, and then hard work, this, that, and the other. But right before you get to the top, you got to watch out for the Swamp of Jazz. This was printed inside a music book back there in the early part of the century.
I think, Harry, when you talk about the beginnings of jazz education, you have to immediately make a distinction with regard to quality and completeness. In other words, there were a lot of inroads made before the three of us got involved with it. But I think in our generation, it's sort of, the models became closer to a state of perfection or completeness or whatever you want to call it. And the quality was much higher.
But there were other considerations too, because you have to keep in mind that at the end of the World War II, they had the GI Bill, and that was Westlake was out there. You had, of course, what we're really talking about now is institutionalized jazz.
That's right.
Because basically,
Yes.
it had not been included in schools, and when we came along, I think because of credentials that we had from a university and the fact that we all had playing experience, then it became acceptable to at least think in those terms. It was not welcomed, at least I didn't feel it was being welcomed.
No, and also I think we need to make a distinction between the sort of jazz education that we're talking about. Like with Jamey's camps, for example, what you have is a total immersion of the student in jazz, day and nights, going on around the clock. I mean, they're living, breathing, and eating jazz music. In the universities, the advantage there is that there's a continuum, because it goes pretty much throughout the school year and for perhaps 4 years. So we have the continuum, but in the university we have the disadvantage that the students' heads are split up in about 10 different directions, because 1 hour they've got an English class, and then they have an improvisation class, and then they go to an animal husbandry class, and so on, you know.
Right.
But they have so many subjects that it's very hard for them to get the kind of focus that they do at Jamey's camps. But Jamey's camps are only 1 week long, so unless we can give them enough materials and things and thoughts to keep them active, and unless they're willing to, as individuals, take all of that to heart and really practice during the year, we have no way of watching over them to be sure that they do it, you know, as we do in the universities, where we can stay on their case.
Of course, I think we'd also be remiss if we didn't mention the fact that even though we are responsible largely for the institutionalization of it, that a model had really been set that nobody could really ever match until Jamey came along, in terms of the kind of people he could get at Lenox, the School of Jazz, because there you had, the year we were there was like JJ, second year Bobby Bruckner, the first year you had Dizzy as a visiting person, the regular faculty, George Russell, Jimmy Giuffre, Bill Evans, the Modern Jazz Quartet, Max Roach, and of course, they were drawing students like Ornette Coleman and other. So there was a kind of a model, except it was a model which was unrealistic, because nobody really until later, and now probably, even now, maybe only Jamey's camps come anywhere near rivaling that, because, you know, now where else can you come and find 27 to 28 saxophone players with the reputation.
I think you have to remember too, though, that a lot of the people that you're mentioning as teachers at Lenox were not teachers, right?
But the model, and they all admitted they weren't teachers.
Well, there are two ways to teach. You can either have someone who is an incredibly good teacher, plus whatever else they might have in the way of talent, and then you have those who are a model in the sense that they might be better termed as an artist in residence, in which the students learn by listening to them perform rather than what they might have in the way of organized materials.
Or some kind of model which combines the two. And that,
that's the ideal.
Yeah.
That's the ideal. All good teachers of jazz should also be performers. Yeah. And I think that's what Jamey's done. I think he's pulled together people that play well, but people who also are good teachers.
So let's look at that for a moment from the standpoint of the evolution of jazz education. It seems that before this time in the late 50s, early 60s, the way that jazz was learned was through the master-apprentice kind of relationship. And these environments like the National Stage Band camps or like the Lennox School or like Jamey's camps, those environments where you brought people together to experience this creative ferment of master players as well as teachers, that wasn't so easy to find. I mean, you had 42nd Street in New York at a certain time, 52nd Street in New York in the 1940s, in a certain time where there was all this music happening. But it seems that one of the innovations that happened at this time was the creation of these environments where master players and amateur aspiring players could come together and explore the music.
Well, Jamey can tell you, though, what a battle it was, you know, moving from the concept of a camp that had a theory class and those things, but it was largely the big bands, and Jamey might want to address the fact because he had to negotiate the terms that ultimately allowed him to do what now is an accepted way to do that.
Mm-hmm. So tell us about that.
Well, I think must have been about 1965 or 4 when Ken Morris asked me to come up to Bloomington and work with the sax sectionals. Would I like to come up? Well, gee, I dropped everything. I said, sure, I'll be there. Live in the dormitory and be around Ron Carter and Oliver Nelson and all these people, and I'm actually on the faculty, and he's going to pay me $100 a week. I'll take it, you know. Well, but after I did that for several years, I always felt sorry for the kids that came that never got the solo on the Friday concert. You had 3 or 4 big bands, and there would be, in each band there'd be 3 or 4 people to stand up and take a solo. Bass player never took a solo, the 4th trombone, the baritone saxophone never took a solo. So I asked Ken Morris, probably about 1970, I said, what about a combo camp where everybody gets attention, and on Friday, believe it or not, everybody solos, including the drummers, the bass players, the violin players, the harmonica player, accordion player, everybody gets a solo. Well, he thought it over for a year, and I'm sure he talked to some of the guys that were in charge, so to speak, of the big band camp. And then he finally said, well, yeah, let's give it a try. So remember that first year over there at Norma,
Illinois.
Bloomington, yeah.
Yes.
And we did it in the big dormitory there, I remember. And the big band camp was the first week, and then a lot of those faculty left, and they bid us well, and we started the combo camp, and that was the first week. And then it was a couple years later, and Ken Morris, who was running these camps, he canceled all the big band ones. He didn't even do them. Next thing you know, he was doing 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 combo camps because there was such a desire to do this. And here we are 30 years later and still doing them, you know.
So why do you think the desire was so strong for small ensemble participation and individual soloing?
Personal expression.
Right.
Who wants to play 5th tenor when you can play 5th tenor and take a solo and learn how to solo? I think it's the natural inquisitiveness of people that spend so much time playing an instrument. Who wants to just read the music on the page? Like a lot of letters I get, I still remember one from a fellow that played in a service band. His wife played in a service band in Washington, D.C. And about his end of the first paragraph is an entire life spent reading music on a page. I want to make my own music.
Yes.
So I think the desire to be creative and to be imaginative and having a place to express this is how we got to where we're at.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, I think it's always been that way. In the days of Jelly Roll Morton, Jelly Roll complained that it was very hard to keep the members of his band happy unless he distributed the little breaks and solos pretty evenly across the group, because they all wanted to express themselves.
Even most of the time he wrote them out. But I think also there was another factor that we have to consider. One of the things that kept it so firmly entrenched as it is in colleges and high schools now is an economic factor. The people who run these things look for one person who can reach the most people. So the big band is firmly entrenched because you got one person who can teach 35 people or 25 or 20. And consequently, people really don't understand that the mentoring that takes place in music, whether it's jazz or otherwise, is really a one-on-one situation, because they still question why a chemistry teacher can teach 500 people and look at the funds that are being generated.
Right.
And they said, well, why do you have to have one person teaching one person? And it's a running battle, and it's so firmly entrenched that it made it difficult at first during the school year, which is why it was so refreshing when all of a sudden Jamey had this camp. Now he's not concerned about that side of it, you know, because he understands that we were playing 8-10 weeks clear across the world.
Yes.
We were everywhere, Australia, we were in Germany, we were in France, we were wherever. And people were so hungry for this that one time we were in Australia, and there must have been, with Greg Quigley, close to 300 or 400 people trying to get into a camp. So
I think there was 125 guitar players. Remember John Schofield was there? Had to break the master class up into two. We had to revise the entire day's schedule because the rooms weren't big enough to accommodate all these people. Something else I wanted to say though about the combo camps. When I suggested to Ken Morris that we do this in 1970, I was thinking it would be neat if you had a piano, bass, drums, and guitar students playing with Tom Haerle on trumpet, or Sonny Rollins, or whoever, a faculty horn person, you know. And then it would be nice if you had 4 horn players, students, alto, tenor, trombone, trumpet, and they got to play with the faculty rhythm section, piano, bass, and drums. But if you do the numbers, you've got to charge each student probably $1,500 or $2,000. So that's when I had to change it. So right off the bat, I didn't get to do what I wanted to do. That was to have the students play with the faculty all week long. Students play with the faculty. And we can't do that because economically it's just impossible. But I was trying to get it down to what you were saying, which is almost one-on-one, but you can't do it. So we've got it down to 1-on-7. 1 faculty for about 7 students. Some of the combos might have 3 people in them, some might have 9. No more than 9, no fewer than probably 3.
But you found a happy medium because Jamey finally evolved a way where the people get to play, everybody, trying to serve everybody, not everybody, but most of the people get a chance to play one day with faculty.
Oh, that's true, yeah.
So there's a kind of a balance there that maybe is a better solution in the sense that they then have to make a lot of decisions among themselves when they're in the other group. And now they have a chance to play and be critiqued by Jerry Coker or Harry Pickens or whoever.
I'd like to return to the business of the ratio between teachers and students that David brought up, because, and this is a true story, the administration at the University of Miami used to ask the then dean of the School of Music, Bill Lee, why it was that we kept having this certain class that never had more than 4 people enrolled in it, and the name of the class was String Quartet.
I like that.
You know, but he's right. They really fight these one-on-one things. The one thing that the upper administration at almost any university cannot understand is why we have private lessons, why we have applied music with 1 student. Why can't you teach 6 or 8 students at the same time? So we have to fight tooth and nail to hang on to that ratio. We have to make up for it with classes that draw very large numbers, like history of jazz or music history, or classes that might have 300, 400, 500, 600 people in them. And that way we can sort of pay for it.
So that also explains to some degree why there are some of the justification for this pin-up demand, because students are in these situations where they don't have the one-on-one attention, and so there's more of a desire for that individual attention and creative expression.
That's right.
I was going to say, when I was the peon at the big band camps in 65, 66, 67, 68, at one year we did one in Salt Lake City, maybe 2 years.
I remember that.
And at the end of the auditions on Sunday, one of the faculty members, I forget who it was, it might have been John Laporte, he says, Jamey, we're going to give you a band. And well, I panicked. You're going to give me a band? Wow, 18 kids? What am I going to do? It was what they called the lizard band.
Yeah.
It was the kids that couldn't play. And it ended up being about 8 people. Actually, I thought they were very good. We made a combo, I wrote out arrangements, we rehearsed, and we played. And I just felt really good about it. We had a great week. I worked and worked and worked. And only when the whole thing was all over did it dawn on me that they'd given me what they thought was the garbage group.
Yeah.
But I made them sound great. And that just, I felt so good about that because they all soloed and we had arrangements. We were trying to sound like Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers or Horace Silver or whatever at the time, And only when it was all over did it dawn on me, the reason they gave me this group is nobody else wanted to take this group. But that was the start of me thinking, well, why don't we have more people doing this if they're going to pay money?
But there was a qualitative change along the way, too. For instance, when the first started, it really was more theoretically aimed. I can remember a time when it was basically a theory class, and the playing was not proliferating the way. Ultimately, across the years, it got to the point where virtually everything at the camp is aimed primarily at playing, whether it's the master class, whether it's the theory class, which is now almost always a performance class. I mean, where you got your instruments in your hand, the way you're going to do it if you actually play, and then music in the afternoon. So in a sense, everything now is performance directed, where at the other camps, it was how to read, it was how to understand theoretical concepts, even though you're trying to learn how to do ear training, and you don't have any instrument in your hand, which is where you're going to use your ears. So there's a qualitative change that has happened across those years too.
And when you use the word performance, you're really using it as a synonym for improvisation.
Well, of course.
Soloing.
Yes.
I remember also over in Illinois one year, I asked Ken Morris or somebody, I said, would it be all right if right after supper, we've got that hour and a half there with nothing to do, could I play some records for the students?
Yes.
Because these kids just don't know the jazz great. So I brought my record player in, all this stuff, and I remember playing Sonny Rollins and Hank Mobley and Miles Davis, and then I played an Albert Ayler or an Ornette Coleman. Well, later on I heard one of the faculty members say to somebody else, "What's Jamey doing playing that stuff in there for those kids? They can't even play the C major scale." And I'm thinking, wow, I can't believe they said that. That's not the right attitude to take.
No.
You got to expose the kids to whatever's going on.
Yes.
You don't say, okay, now you can't play the C major scale, so I'm not going to show you any of this stuff over here until you can perform this properly. That didn't enter into my mind.
Well,
You
that's the same creative problem we have with young children who study piano with a classical pianist, and I don't mean to, rub anyone the wrong way, but if that child invents a little song during the week and they come to the teacher for the lesson, they say, "I made up a little song, would you like to hear it?" It's always, "Oh, no, here, read your scales, read your studies."
Well, I think what we brought to the table too was, I think that there was a prevailing notion that somehow or another, if you understood that this scale went with that chord, that enabled you then to play, but they weren't teaching the listening thing, because first of all, if you can't speak the language, it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference how much facility and how much understanding of those relationships. And so for the first time, I think with this generation, where we came through as teachers, we were having the people listen to music. When somebody tells me they haven't heard Nicka's Dream or they haven't heard these pieces, how do you understand the language? Lida mentioned a friend of mine, my wife, and I won't mention what instrument, who plays and plays really well, but she said when we heard this person a few days ago, there's nothing of the language. I mean, that's a phenomenal playing, right scales, right chords, right relationship, but it's not the language. It's like us talking to somebody from science, and we're talking about gigs and talking about changes. That's like talking Greek to them. And by the same token, if you start talking about the tables of elements and stuff, that would be Greek to us, even though we are literate and learned people. So what we did was change the attitude about learning the language.
But it still needs to be changed, because in my advanced improv class, one of my early assignments was, on your cassette or your mini disc, I want you to play Sweet Georgia Brown in all 12 keys. Everybody did it. Everybody sounded pretty good. And the piano player happened to mention that he had written it all out in 12 keys and played it. Now, can you imagine taking the time to write out? I mean, we can't fathom that.
No.
But this is somebody who's probably about 29 years old. But he hasn't listened a lot to music, see? Well, I since got him off of that. I said, I don't want you to write anything out. Everything's got to be done by ear. And he's doing much better.
Yes.
But it's interesting that if he hadn't just happened to say that, I would have thought that he'd played it by ear the way we would have done, worked it out, and then made his tape for me.
Sure.
But he wrote it all out first. So that's that academia coming back in there, where that written page as your as your safety,
safety
your
net,
lifesaver, your safety net there.
Well, some of your play-along volumes, in particular volume 61, the Cherokee track, and 68 and 67 as well, all of the tracks are tunes that are done in all 12 keys. And when I give those to my students to work on, and I do that often because it's turned out to be one of the most fruitful experiences that they can go through, I always tell them, learn the tune in the original key, look at the changes and see how it all hangs together, how one thing leads to another, and then get rid of that and don't even look at the other keys. Do the rest of it in your head and in your ears to find your way.
Well, you know, that brings us to the topic of our next segment. We've begun by talking a little bit about the history and evolution of these camps. In just a moment, we're going to take a look at the distinction of how one learns to play jazz, how one learns to improvise, pedagogy, your particular innovations in that area, the play-alongs, your work in the jazz idiom, the jazz language, your work in jazz pedagogy, and take a look at how one bridges that gap between hearing jazz, appreciating it, loving it, and actually learning how to play it.
Good.
Thank you. So we're going to you want to take a minute or two?
Yeah, yeah, because boy, the ferment we're at the stage now where we really can talk about what we do.
There we go. I'll try out.
First segment, it sounded great, looked great. So same deal, we'll just open back up to 2.
Okay.
And Ralph will give me the word here any minute.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Harry Pickens. We're here with David Baker, Jerry Coker, and Jamey Aebersold, some of the founders of jazz education. In this segment, we're going to talk a little about Can I start over, please?
Can that be on the World's Funniest Outtakes?
I don't think it's even going to come close to World's Funniest Outtakes. Maybe to my mother. Okay. Hello, I'm Harry Pickens. I'm here with David Baker, Jerry Coker, and Jamey Aebersold. And we're going to talk a little bit about the process of jazz improvisation, how one learns jazz improvisation, how you teach it, how your work as educators changed the paradigm of jazz pedagogy for those who desire to learn jazz.
Wow.
I can tell you,
once again, I think we need to make, it's one thing to talk about us as jazz pedagogues, as people who teach people to play jazz, and quite another to talk about how we would teach the subject of jazz pedagogy, which might relate to everything that our students might have to teach when they go to work at some university after graduation.
I'd rather see us deal with it first as improvisation.
I would too.
Before we move to the broader.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I can only speak with my own experience. I remember when I was an aspiring jazz pianist in the 70s, there were 4 references that were like Bibles for me. One of them was the Mahegan series on piano.
John Mahegan.
Another was Jerry's book on the jazz idiom. Another was David's book on jazz improvisation. I have the first edition in the comb binding, 1975 edition. And the other was Jamey Aebersold's play-along records, specifically the number 6, which is the Bird volume, and Nothing But Blues. I still remember the day in 1977 in Brunswick, Georgia, when I got that big package with the red label from Aebersold Jazz, you know, that had the full-page adds and downbeats with these records, and I put it on, and there was Kenny Barron and Ron Carter and Ben Riley, and the world changed from that time. You know, and I've talked to many older musicians who said they never had those kinds of experiences, and it's so much easier now because of the excellence of those materials and because of your work. So, improvisation, go ahead.
Well, I think one of the things that happened with all of us is that we tried to recreate the manner in which we learned it, but not put it into something that has exponential kinds of references and influences.
And then cross half of it out because we realized that we didn't need to do that.
That we didn't need to do that. Yeah. So it was a question of trying to take how we learned. You know, whether it was playing along with a record or with listening to somebody and asking questions, or my experiences with somebody like George Russell, learning about chord scales. Even though I'd been doing that, I didn't know that's what I was doing. So trying to put into words or into concepts that could be presented to youngsters, or youngsters meaning not chronological age, but any age of people trying to learn, but trying to synthesize those experiences and then communicate them to somebody else.
What motivated all of you to want to do that, to take this mysterious music and translate it so that others could learn it more easily? What motivated you to? I mean, many great players and musicians are not motivated to pass it on and codify in that way.
I don't know what exactly motivates them, but after I came off the road from Woody Herman's band and was living in San Antonio, Texas, Patty, whom I at that time, she was a friend. We hadn't married yet. We've been married for 47 years now, but we weren't married yet. She called me on the phone and asked me to take on 2 students to teach them jazz improvisation, and it turned my whole stomach into a huge, conglomerate of butterflies and things, and it really scared the daylights out of me, because I knew in one instant what a grave responsibility that was, and I didn't feel up to it. I really didn't, because I hadn't thought about it. I was still thinking about playing, and playing with different people. So but I also knew in my heart that I couldn't refuse to do it, and I think that's what you're talking about, because I remembered all those times when I was young, when I would go to hear famous bands and things, and try to hang out, near the dressing rooms or the exit to the theaters and this sort of thing, and ask them for an autograph and then ask them for questions while they were there. And I remember a number of them really trying to help. And that, to me, I appreciated then, and I thought that's the right model. We should be willing to transmit that information to others. I was frightened of it, but I took it on, and I did just exactly what David was talking about. Made a long list of things that I had done, and then I started crossing off the things that really didn't mean anything, and adding a few that were not on, that I never went through, but which I felt sure was a part of it. But I don't think we can refuse to do it. I think that's an obligation, a moral obligation even.
I had some jazz training here in Louisville as a teenager. We had a little band called the Nighthawks, and the bass player said, hey, they're giving some lessons in Louisville, $10 for 10 lessons, go with me. I must have been 15 years old because I wasn't driving, and so I told him no for about a month, and finally I said I'd go. I was scared to death, and it was Don Murray and Sam Dennison and Dave Klingman and Gene Klingman, and I'm up there by myself with my saxophone hanging from my neck, and thinking I knew a lot because we had this little dance band at home, and they asked me to play a tune as an audition, and I said, oh, just anything. Well, I think they named Foggy Day, and I'm thinking, man, I've got that on record with Ted Nash. Boy, he plays it great, but I certainly don't know it. I said, well, I don't think I know that one. And Don Murray says, well, pick something you know, Jamey. And I said, well, just anything. He picks another tune. I don't know that. And he asked me again, and I say again. I know I said it 3 times. I said, oh, anything, And finally, he just slams his hands on the top of the piano and says, we're wasting time. Pick a tune. So now I'm really nervous, haven't played a note. And I'm thinking, what tune can I play? What tune can I play? And I say, oh, yeah, Tenderly. The arrangement by Johnny Warrington, the first 8 measures, has the alto sax, that's me, playing the melody to Tenderly. So I said, Tenderly. And it's not a jazz tune as such. And he says, okay, fine. And he gives this big arpeggio. And I say to myself, man, I'm in big trouble. Before that, he asked me what key we're in. I said, it starts on my G. He says, fine. And he gives me this arpeggio. And all of a sudden, I realized I knew absolutely, positively nothing. And I played through it. And then when we got through, he says, okay, let me hear you improvise. And I'm standing there thinking, let me see if I got this straight. I don't know anything. He asked me, I don't know any tunes. He asked me what key it's in. I don't know. And I start to play it. I don't even know the tune. I can't play the melody. And now he's asking me to improvise. And when I tell people this, I say, and I was really embarrassed for about 30 seconds. And then I said, okay, now I paid my $10. Let's get on with this. And teach me something. Well, when I went to college, an awful lot of people at IU who were practicing in the rooms next to me were going to be music ed people. I didn't think they sounded very good. So I put the word out to everybody that would listen, I'll never be a teacher, not me. Cancel that. I never really told them why, but my ears told me that these people were not going to be very good band directors, period, and I wouldn't want my kids studying with them, so I'll tell everybody I'm not going to be that. And then probably about my 4th year, I'd been studying privately with you, Gene Monteus comes up to me out there in the parking lot at IU and says, hey, Jamey, it's May Day, it's pretty outside. He says, I just got a job teaching high school. And I teach privately down in Seymour, Indiana. How would you like to do that? I froze, just like you said. Butterflies in my stomach. I'm standing there, and all I can think is, man, I've told the whole world I would never teach. How can I do this? And I'm thinking, well, I'm getting married. I need the money. And I wasn't thinking it might be fun. I was seeing butterflies and dollar bills. That's all I was seeing. He said, well, it pays $2 a lesson. If everybody shows up, you make about 20 bucks. You start at 8 o'clock, get through around 4 or 5. If nobody shows up around lunchtime, you can go eat lunch. And for some reason, I said, well, I'll do it. And I drove down there scared to death and dove in and loved it. But along the way, there was a real good flute player, Dr. Black. He was a doctor in town, and he had 2 daughters, and one of them played the flute. And one day we got through with our lesson early. It was only 30-minute lessons, and I said, that's 1961 or 2. I said, let me hear you play on D minor scale, no sharps and no flats. So I'm comping on the piano, and she's soloing, and she sounds great. I can tell that what she's playing is coming straight from her brain, and it's matching her fingers, and she's making music. And then we tried another key, and I'm sitting there all befuddled inside me because I'm thinking, if somebody's going to play jazz, they have to have a big stack of records, drink a lot of coffee, and be grumpy all the time because they don't play what they want to play, you know? That was my opinion of a jazz person then. But here she is just sitting doing what I asked her to do. So I asked someone else later in the day to improvise, and they can improvise. And this big light came on in my head which said, wow, I wonder if everybody can do this. You know, if you tell them what you're doing.
Sure.
So that's how I got started teaching.
Right.
Well, for me, it was a little easier.
Play-on records came a lot later.
Right.
But just asking people to improvise and knowing inside that they could, if you just guided them a little bit, that was my day of awakening.
Well, I started like with Wes telling me you'll hear it, which was usually death sentence, because he really believed that he knew he couldn't put labels on it. What we did is start putting labels on it. But I can remember I had an easier road because my first students really were Freddie Hubbard and Gary Campbell and people like this who could already play. It wouldn't make any difference what I did with Freddie. Freddie was going to play. And so all I had to do was begin to think which things rang a bell with him.
Right.
You know, and I think that what more than anything else we did is to isolate the components. A 2/5 record, because we know that's in every tune.
Right.
A book of patterns, because we know that's in every tune. And all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but across 10 years, these things then were coalesced in a different sort of way. So you got patterns. All of a sudden there's the green book with the 2/5s. And all of a sudden you put the patterns on the 2/5s. Now you got a way to communicate this isolated information to universal situations. I can tell you, and I won't tell you who it was, but a very, very famous jazz musician did one of these things at the New York Public Library. And that musician came up to me and he said, why are you giving our stuff away to all those people? And it never occurred to me that this was something that had to be like the Masons or something where I had to hide all of it. And I said, you know, it belongs to everybody. You're giving our stuff away. And I thought about it for a few minutes and I said, boy, that's great, ain't it? And it disarmed him.
Yeah.
And you know, in later years, you know, that attitude dissipated. But I'm sure that whether it was voiced or not, that was something, because the musicians who felt threatened, because we're teaching people to take our jobs,
right,
which is a great thing to do.
Right. Well, that's once again, you can go way back in history to the time when Freddie Keppard, for quite a while, refused to make any records because he knew that as soon as he did, people were going to take off his solos and play, and then he was going to be out of a gig, and they'd have it instead.
So he hit his fingers. He would play with a handkerchief over his hands, so they couldn't see what. I'm serious.
Yeah.
They couldn't see what fingerings he was using. And when Maynard played the Titans with the New York Philharmonic, people were coming up to examine what he had done to the horn that made it sound like that would allow him to play doubles and triple C's. So it's that whole mystery thing that has surrounded the music.
Well, I remember hearing a musician say that if you can hear it, you can have it. You can hear it, you can have it.
Okay.
But David, tell us a little bit more about how you went from Wes Montgomery, I'm assuming, correct, saying you'll hear it, to developing a real systematic approach for yourself.
Well, the best thing that ever happened to me was the fact that I wasn't born with the innate ability to do all of this. Because I think if I could have done it already, I probably would have said the same thing Wes did. But because I couldn't do it, I had to figure some way to survive. And in trying to figure out how to survive, it meant putting labels on things. Because I could play what J.J. played. You know, I would listen to the record, and you could always tell the J.J. records where his solo was because it was smooth. These are 78s for people who don't know anything about records. But I didn't know how to move that from one place to another. And Slide and I laugh about the fact when we learned out that a tune could have a bridge, And boy, we just luxuriated for a month in thinking that all tunes had the same bridge. You know, and so it was a question of being able to isolate the information and then contextualize it. And that was what I think that we have been able to do as a body of three, and plus Dan Haerle. You know, that we've been able to do, and basically everything that has happened since that really is a replication of those basic principles. Now, people have refined it, they found their own way to look at it, they've written legions of books. When we were started, the downbeat was a page long with jazz materials. And now, what is it, 50 pages in your stuff?
What David said too about the teaching process and how you approach it, and he said, I was fortunate that the students who first came to me could already do it, people like Gary Campbell and Freddie Hubbard and all. And that brings up the point that there are people who are especially gifted at teaching the very young. My first teacher was like that. Jimmy Casal, one of the co-authors of Patterns for Jazz, was like that, and Jamey is like that. Jamey can walk into a room of a couple of hundred people who have never improvised. Often they're educators, and but had never improvised, and as soon as he walks in the room, he tells them to get out their horns, and 5 minutes later they're playing something, they're doing something. And that's an innate ability to work with the uninitiated and get them in gear very early. I don't have that kind of a talent, and you probably don't either.
Not to that degree,
it's a special
that's for sure.
talent that some people have, and I love it that there are people who can do that, and I wish I could. But like David, I tend to be most useful to the ones who are a little further along.
Of course, that's also the reason why I insist on teaching the beginning improvisation. I'll never let anybody have the beginning improvisation, because I know that it's something that now I've refined and really understand and really love. And so they don't care who comes on my faculty, they get to teach the upperclassmen or whatever, because I want the ones where I know they have to have that foundation. Because if you try to build a story house starting on the second story, it's what, like it says in the Bible, a house built on shifting sands.
Well, there's another aspect to that too, and I'm confronted with that every year when I teach jazz piano classes. I will not permit a pianist to teach the class, because I know very well that if I have someone like, say, Donald Brown, who's on our faculty at UT, if I have Donald Brown teach the class, he's liable to, or Harry Pickens, you know, they're liable to say, well, this is the way I want you to play it, and rattle it off. And the students are sitting there saying, yeah, well, that's easy for you. You're a pianist. I'm not a pianist. I'm a trombone player. I'm a guitar player, what have you. But when they see someone like David or myself or Jamey up there teaching a jazz piano class, then they have to say, well, shoot, if he can do it, I can do it too. You know, it gives them confidence, and that's the way it should be.
Exactly.
You know, you reminded me of something, David, when you were talking at the big band camps. When they started out, like I said, I was just a peon, and I was happy to be there, delighted. But I'd get there for the auditions, but I didn't run the auditions, so there'd be one or two people, I won't mention any names, but they were the ones talking to the students and this, that, and the other, and I'd just be sitting there. And I can distinctly remember a couple times where when the student would leave the audition, the faculty member would say to me or to the other faculty member, man, they can't play, and that wasn't the language they used, but they just put them down. And I was thinking, man, that's not the right thing to say. These people have paid money. They paid money to be here. Or granted, if they could play, they wouldn't be here. And I'm thinking, boy, that's the wrong attitude to take. And that happened several times, and one time it happened real bad, where the faculty person misunderstood something the student said, and the faculty person cussed them out. And I just walked in the room, and I couldn't believe my ears. And the boy, then he left, had his audition, he left, and I went outside. He had come, he played flute, he had come on a bus. He was going to get on a bus and leave the camp. This is the first day. He's only been there 10 minutes. And the faculty member is cussing him out. And I went out and I told him, I said, look, this is really unusual. This is not the way the workshop is. You ought to stick around. There's a lot of great people here. You're going to have a great time. And he did stay. But boy, that embedded thing in my brain.
Sure.
And it was probably, that was 4 or 5, 6 years before I ever got around to doing my cap. But I think a big sign back there, man, if you ever get a chance to do this, don't act like that.
Well, their first impression is extremely important, as is their early growing period. When I was teaching at the University of Miami, one of my graduate assistants took an improvisation class, was teaching the improvisation class, and there was a young saxophonist in it who was just a couple of years younger than the grad assistant and who was having a lot of struggles. And my grad assistant said to him, "Oh man, you're never going to be able to play." Well, the student respected him, and so he was walking around, and I didn't know about it. He was walking around for days with his head down, he was all depressed, and I said, "Hey, what's wrong?" And he told me what had happened in the class, and I said, "All right, for starters, put that out of your memory. It means nothing. He doesn't know whether or not you can play. That's for starters. And secondly, you're not going to learn to play by being depressed with the feeling that you can't play." And then I went around to the grad assistant and I said, "Don't you ever tell anybody that again. Never, because you don't know." And sure enough, 3 or 4 years later, the student who had been told he couldn't play was playing circles around the guy who told him he couldn't.
Well, the real irony of all of that is that attitude becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes,
if you tell somebody
that's
they
right.
can't do that, unless they're stubborn and decide, "I'll show you,"
Right.
which I hope they would be,
Yes.
then they don't play. And I think it has to be, I love the whole notion of anybody can learn to play. Now, none of us is naive enough to think that we can create a Michael Brecker or we can create a Chick Corea. But what we can do is create an environment and a learning situation that allows them to maximize whatever talent they've got. And I don't remember anybody ever being turned away from the camp. They come to the camp, and if they're serious about learning, we all bend over backwards, and not just the ones. It's the reason why I find it very disingenuous when I see people who actually say to us, "Man, you can't teach anybody to play," and yet they accept big dollars to go out and do clinics. I said, if you really believe that, then the honorable thing would be to say, because I'll say in a minute, when they say, "You can't teach anybody to play jazz," I said, "That's probably right. You can't teach anybody to play jazz." And leave it at that,
Well, that's when people come up to me, and I'm sure that's just happened to Jamey and David too, and they have their head hung and they say, "Well, I just play by ear," very apologetically. My reaction to that is, "Wonderful, that's great, because I can teach you the theory of it in a matter of a few weeks. You won't have any trouble with that, but I can't turn your ears around in that space of time, and you already have done that. This is going to be a piece of cake for you."
Speaking of things that turn one's ears around, I'd like to talk a little bit about the play-along records and how they began and the impact that they've had on so many. They certainly were an important place for my own development, the idea of actually being able to play, close my eyes, put the headphones on, and pretend that I was playing with Ron Carter or whoever. It was profound, not to mention the musical impact. So how did that all start?
I know Jamey needs to be the one to address this, but I'd like to simply preface it with the fact that there were play-alongs before Jamey, just as there were books before my books and that sort of thing, and before David's books and all. That's really not the point. I mean, there was a Music -1, and there was a Join the Band album that Billy May arranged, and
the one of
there
Oscar
were
Peterson,
a host
and
of
Ed
other,
Thigpen, and Ray
what they
Brown.
used to call rhythm records, and I used them a lot. The difference is quality. That's what made the difference. When Jamey's play-alongs came along, they just outdistanced any other effort of that type, and continued to do so.
Was that because of the musicians on them, because of how they were
No,
structured?
Everything about
everything
about
about
it.
Concept, as well as
the
musicians.
selection of the tunes, the way it was. Well, actually, I don't know if you want to talk about it or not, or if you even want it said, but I still have a copy of the first edition,
David
Volume
Lahm?
1, with David Lahm on it. And it's really funny to listen to, because it was evidently before Jamey, realized that the rhythm section was not going to play like they were accompanying something if there was nothing going on. And so sure enough, David Lum starts out doing pretty good, you know, and then as the track goes on, he begins to play more and more and more, and by the end of the track, he's practically taking a solo, because he didn't have anything to play with.
Yeah.
And also he had no precedent either. So, you know, he was a neophyte at this. You know, we met Jamey up at the camp, and so he didn't know what, but I still have my copies of that blue.
Yeah.
Blue.
Yes.
We did that down at George Holden's music store. Did you know that? Down by the railroad track. And we had to stop.
Still there.
We had to stop at one point because the train went by. It was right next to it. So we had to take a break while the train went by.
Jeanette Recording Studios.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, talk a little bit about that.
Well, I bought a Music -1 record, and I think Clark Terry was on it.
Yes,
but the thing that bothered me was Clark would solo for a chorus, and then I was supposed to solo for a chorus, and then he'd solo for a chorus, and I'd solo for a chorus. And I was thinking, man, I can't get in because he's playing all the time. So that was the seed.
Plus, you got to know his solo.
Oh, I sure got to know his solo. Yeah, that's for sure. But I was already listening to other records, and I bought them to listen to, and I thought this thing was going to have like 4 minutes of the blues where I could just play with Milt Hinton and Ozzie Johnson and whoever else it was on that record. And then there was a little one that came, I think, with a Downbeat magazine. No, that was Oscar Pettiford. There was a play-along that I bought, and it's a piece of music and had about 8 tunes in it. And I played that record over and over. I remember bugging the band director. I was in high school, and he never would start a jazz band, so finally we started our little group called the Nighthawks, and he kind of got upset with me. But I remember him saying, well, Jamey, you want to play the jazz? Why don't you at the ball game, the basketball game this Friday night, why don't we, at intermission, instead of having the band play like they always do up there in the balcony, why don't you bring your record player and you play some of these tunes? So I did. I played Jada and maybe the Charlestown and something else. I couldn't wait. Had a microphone sitting there. I'd love to have a video of me up there in the balcony playing, because I practiced, and you know how it is, you get to the end of a 4-bar phrase or something and the chord maybe goes to a dominant 7th, and you know that the 3rd is a good one. So if I went this way, I wouldn't be able to get down to the 3rd on my saxophone. So I kind of had it all worked out how I was going to weave my way around. That was my first play-along record that I played with over and over. But actually getting the play-alongs started, Harry, we were at a camp, a big band camp in Storrs, Connecticut, and I was doing my thing, 1966, running sax sectionals, and at the end of the week I was given a private lesson. I was playing the piano, two sax players, and one of them at the end of the lesson said, Jamey, when you get home, would you make me a reel-to-reel tape of what you're doing, Just Friends and blues and There'll Never Be Another You? And I said, gee, that sounds like a good idea. I'll do that for you. I never did it, but I kind of went and made this record. And then when I made the record, we recorded the record down at George Holden's store. Then I realized, wow, if somebody buys the record, there's nobody soloing, they're going to want their money back, so I better write a book. I said, write a book. Oh, man, that took forever to put the book together. And then finally got that together and made the 500 records, and they were out of tune. RCA pressed them in Indianapolis. I didn't know that they could do them at different speeds, and they did. They were out of tune. I had to take them all back up. They repressed them, got them in tune. So it was an interesting experience, and I really thought that this was it. Chuck Suber at Downbeat Magazine had told me if I were to do this, he would buy 100. So I'd done the math. I figured if I sold him 100 at wholesale price, it almost paid for the 500 records and 1,000 books or 500 books. Can't lose. Let's do it. Plus, then I'll have a bunch of records I can play with and give them to my friends.
And what year was this?
That was 67.
Right.
And came out with it, yeah. So then I started a business, you know, and people are sending me a check for $7.99. I'm writing their book and a name in the book and address and everything, putting a check mark. Then I'm taking a record in the book and packaging it up, and then I'm taking it down to the drugstore, the sub post office, and mailing it. Incidentally, that's an interesting story. I didn't know what the postage was, so I took it down there one day. Instead of going all the way down to the post office in New Albany, I went down to the sub post office, Walks drugstore, and I laid 2 or 3 of these little cardboard things with one record and one book in them, and she kind of takes them and shoves them like that. And I said, what's the matter? She says, I can't take that. I said, well, why not? The big scale's right here, you know. She says, that's jazz. I said, it's jazz? I said, well, and I'd walked in from the front door. They had 2 doors. I walked in from the front door, and a bunch of my classmates that I'd gone to high school with, girls, worked at the bank across the street, and they were there. And I'd stopped and said hello to them. And here I am, and I'm thinking they're all listening. And she can't take my educational stuff because it's jazz. Well, right away, I feel like I'm selling something that's dirty. You know, so I kind of back up and I say, well, it's educational jazz. It's teaching people how to play. And she says something else, and then I start to go like that, and then I got mad. I said, wait a minute, this is the post office. Yeah. I got no place else to go. I want this mail. Well, about that time, the owner came out and he says, is there a problem? I said, she won't take this stuff. You know, but he doesn't say a word. He doesn't. I pay I go home, I call the postmaster. They closed the post office a week later in that drugstore.
Headline, Jazz closes post office.
Educational jazz closes the post office. So that's how I got started, and I thought if it was going to be a good thing that the Berklee School of Music, who was putting out various big band arrangements by Oliver Nelson and so forth, I figured if it was a good thing, they'd take it over, didn't think any more about it. And then somebody said, probably 3 years later, why don't we do a blues one? And I'm thinking, what do we need that for? Well, we did the blues one, and I upped my 2-line sentence in downbeat to classify it to 4 lines, and when I did that, I realized I sold more of volume 1. I said, wow, is that the way it works? And
so for 3 years, you only had the one
Yeah,
record?
only had the one, yeah. Yeah, and then we came out with volume 2, nothing but blues, and then Dan Haerle suggested doing a volume 3. Why don't we do something with the 251? And I'm thinking, who in the world is going to know what 251 is? You know, big Roman numeral letters, 251. We did it, sold more of volume 1, sold more of volume 2, and I'm thinking, this is interesting. So that's how I got started.
Well, the thing was so important is that it moved from the functional kinds of things, the 251, turnbacks and whatever, then all of a sudden now to the real thing of being able to play standard tunes with the right changes, jazz tunes with the right changes, and then high specificity things, the music of Billy Strayhorn, the music of Charlie Parker, the music of Dizzy, of whoever. And it was interesting when I read the thing that Jerry Mulligan said he used to hate practicing, but what he would do is get up and put on the play-along record and turn everything off but the bass. And I've heard that come from so many people who are pros. And you know, the thing that's so valuable is you don't have to go through the public embarrassment. Now you can make all the mistakes at home in your basement or until your parents get tired of hearing that record playing over and over. And the business, of course, of the separation, where you've got the bass and the piano, and you can take the piano out, you can take the bass out. And it seems to me, like Jamey says, and it's not, I don't think it's hyperbole, that it's changed the way people learn how to play jazz. Because we give them the material, but you also have to give them a vehicle for being able to try that material out. Now, ultimately, you got to go out there and get, because we tried to do it by playing along with the record. And I would wait for the piano solo so I could drown him out when I played with just the record. But to have a whole record where there's 10 minutes of a B-flat major scale, man, I can cover so much ground with that, you know, that's marvelous.
That brings up another point, and that is that a lot of people think the play-alongs are just a means of having fun, and for some that's exactly what it is. Some people think it's for learning tunes, and for some people that's the most valuable thing about it. To me, the most valuable thing, and that's what you're bringing up with that, is that I always have to tell students, remind them that anything that you learn to play, a new scale, a new pattern, or a new idea, or whatever it is, it needs to be done against the harmonic accompaniment for that particular thing, because otherwise it becomes meaningless. You may not, in your mind's ear, you may be hearing a completely different thing than what would really fit that thing that you're working with. So if you've got 10 minutes of a C major scale, then you've got ample time to find out, you know, what works and what it sounds like,
and what won't
put the
work.
two together, knit them together.
You know, we're talking about the pedagogical side of this, of the play-along records, but the side that since I'm the one selling them and producing them and this, that, and the other, I get the letters. And the letters that I like most are the ones from some old man or some older woman, really over 50, 60, 70 years old, who's always wanted to play this type of music, and they just love it, and they always say, I wish I had it when I was a kid. So I know I'm bringing music into this person's bedroom or their den or their garage or their attic or wherever they're at with that little CD player or cassette player, and that just makes me feel good that they can play along with, like you said, Ron Carter and Kenny Barron and Ben Rowley or whoever, Dan Haerle or whoever it is. They got a good rhythm section, good time, playing good changes, and they love it. And they're not really thinking about becoming a great jazz player or anything. They're just playing music, which kind of makes me feel like, you know, I'm sure all of us think music is part of the universe. It's just part of everything that's out there. It's like air and water, and there's music. And people like to improvise. And I suspect a lot of people buy the play-along records and probably never improvise, but they want to play that melody to High, High the Moon
or sing
over and over. You know what I mean? And feel like they're on Carnegie Hall playing.
course, it's got to be wonderful, though, to know that you can walk in to the home, as I did many times, of the late J.J. Johnson, and find out he's getting ready to go back on the road, so he's playing with the player. He told me that it took him, a while when he hadn't been playing before he would get ready to go on the road. He said, so he would play with the play-alongs, but the week before he got ready to go on the road with Nat Adderley or whoever he was going on the road, he said he would turn up as loud as he could and play till his lips were just tingling, getting him ready. Then he would have to go out on the road, and it would take him another week to play into top form. Right. But he already had the means to at least be ready to be combative, if you want to use that term, when you get ready to go out and play. And that has to be gratifying to know that.
There's when we came out with the volume 61 play along, that's the burning, the fast one. That's the one I sent you a cassette copy, and you proceeded to write me back and tell me that all the tempo markings were incorrect. Yeah. I don't know if I ever told you the story about that or not. I got
you had two metronomes and they were different speeds.
I had one I'd always use, and a little black one, with the light on the top. And I'm looking at your letter, and my first thought is, gosh, have we put this out yet with all the wrong tempo markings? And we hadn't, so I said, safe. Okay, let me see what Jerry's got to say. Okay, the first tune is off by 40 beats. The second one's off by 30. I'd marked them all too slow. So I went over and got my metronome, and I set it up, and I had the DAT tape at that point. I put the DAT in, listened to the first tune, and I said, wow, Jerry's right. Man, my metronome, something's wrong with it. Check the second tune, check all of them, they're all off. And I looked at it and I said, isn't this something? This metronome is worn out, but its last gasp before I throw it in the trash can is, it allowed me to tell all these three musicians that are playing these extremely fast tempos, for 74 minutes or whatever it is, I told them all wrong. Instead of it being 340, I told them it was 298. So everybody thought they were playing slower than they really were. What's the matter with me?
Psychologically, that's great.
It was marvelous. Yeah. And I sat there looking at this black box thinking, there is a God. this is great. I mean, I did throw it away. I checked it with another metronome, but I was thinking, isn't it something that it would fall apart on the fast tempos? Because I remember Todd telling me, a couple times, Todd was a bass player, he'd say, Jamey, how long is this one going to be? I'd say, well, we want it to be at least 5 minutes, Todd. And oh, okay. That's just, but what I was leading up to, when I sent that out, Herb Alpert wrote back and he said, this is really an interesting one. Shines a spotlight on the weak links in the chain.
Yes.
And then J.J. Johnson wrote me. I've got it posted on the wall. He said, getting ready to go to Japan, practicing with the play-alongs. Volume 61.
That's JJ, always. Yes.
Thank you for those words about jazz pedagogy. So we'll break for a moment.
But with Jay, because Jay was one of those people who prepared so much.
Oh, yeah,
right. And when he got ready to do the string album,
said, I can't play that. And you already did.
You were mentioning Fats Navarro. I went over to Indiana, Pennsylvania, probably 20 years ago, and did a one-day thing. And at the end, it was like 4 o'clock, and we had to leave at 5 o'clock to go to Pittsburgh to catch the plane to let me go home. Anyhow, the guy says, I've got my jazz band lined up here, all 20 kids. He said, I'd like you to sit at the grand piano and critique each one of them. I said, fine. So I pointed to this kid over here, a trumpet player. I said, why don't we start with you? I said, what would you like to play? He says, I'd like to play Prince Albert. I said, oh, great. He takes a solo, it sounds bebop, it's just great. I said, boy, that is excellent. Okay, how about you? What would you like to play? He said, well, I'd like to play Green Dolphin Street. Okay, we dive into it, not good, we stop. I said, do you really know this? He said, no, I really don't know it. I said, well, let's play something, He said, well, let's play a blues. Play a blues, okay. Everybody else plays the blues. The hour is almost up. I come back to him and I say, okay, let me hear you, why don't we kind of summarize this? Let's hear this fellow play the blues. He dives in, he can't play the blues. He doesn't know anything. And we play, like for a minute or a minute and a half, and I look at him, I say, I'm really confused. You don't know the blues? Oh, no, I don't know the blues. I said, how in the world do you not know the blues, but yet you can play Prince Albert? And he says, well, I've never played the blues. I said, yeah, but you can play Prince Albert. He said, oh, my roommate's got the record of Fats Navarro. He said, I've just listened to it over and over and over, and I can follow the changes. And I'm thinking,
that's great.
Lordy, give me a break. He's playing on All the Things You Are, and he can't play blues. And that's the one thing
that's
he could
beautiful,
do.
though.
Yeah.
The ear.
The
yes.
ear.
Yes.
The ear. But he didn't have any idea what he was doing. And like we're talking about, he couldn't transfer any of those licks or patterns or knowledge to any other tune.
But he's already
Sure.
given you the method for being able to let him do that. That's the
true.
great thing.
That's
That
right.
was an interesting day. I wish I'd had that on tape.
What are some of the other most interesting experiences that you've had teaching together at the camps?
Letting them do their thing,
Well,
and me
actually-
not get in the way.
Actually, we don't see each other as much as you might think,
That's true.
because Jamey has an awful lot to do to stay on top of it administratively and all, and so he's all over the place, and for very brief moments. I mean, I have to grab him in the hall to get my paycheck, you know what I mean? But, and David and I are doing some of the same things at the same time, so we don't get to see each other very much. Quite often, it's not until the last concert
day.
of the week
Yeah,
or
yeah.
on the night of your concert or my concert. But we don't, there's not that much interaction between us when we're at the camp, because the camp, as I said earlier, is day and night. I mean, it's a very busy affair.
But I would see different things. I can tell you, I inherited the top theory class, and I didn't realize that theory class had been a theory class. And so my first thought was, I can't teach you how to play talking about it.
Right.
So we got the instruments out, and there were a lot of people who, really did well on the theory tests. But when they got in there to find out, all of a sudden, now you have to move it from here to here. And it took a while before that metamorphosis took place, that they came in there.
Or from here
Yeah,
to here.
yeah, and then to here.
Right.
Yeah, it took a while for the metamorphosis to take place that allowed them to begin knowing that when they came in there, get the horn out, and have the horn ready to play. I tell people, like when I left Indiana University, I could take dictation, and I could take dictation like the wind. And I tell them, I said, I walked around New York for 2 months and nobody never did ask me to take no dictation. so it taught me a lesson that I better have, whatever I'm talking about, I better be able to do on my instrument.
Yeah, it's unfortunate at our camps that right here at the University of Louisville that we don't get to see one another very much. When they were smaller, we could hang out a little more, and I remember out in Greeley, Colorado, in California, at the end of the week on Friday, we would have that 45-minute spot where the faculty would line up and the people would ask questions, which was interesting, but also sometimes we got questions that were kind of off the wall. So
and answers too.
Yeah, and answers too, yeah. I do remember one time with Jerry, though, I was trying to summarize at Greeley, Colorado at the end of the week at the listening class what you should be able to do. So I said, Jerry, bring your tenor in, sit on the chair, I'll hit a chord, you hit one note, and that note could either be in the scale or out of the scale, but from that one note, tell us what the scale is. And I'm sure you remember this. You had your sax kind of on your lap like this, and I hit like an E minor chord or something, and you said, without even raising the sax to your mouth, you said E minor. And I didn't expect this. And I looked over and said, hey, yep, that's right. Okay, let's try another one. So, and he says, oh, F sharp half diminish. So we went through, I don't know how many, 6 or 7. I think I probably stood up and said, okay, that's it. This is what you need to be able to do. You don't need to put your horn up. You hear it, and you know what it is, and you can recognize it on the keyboard, and that's really going to help you to play. Listen to him. Do whatever he did.
I remember something else we did in that, and it was one of the most fun things that I ever got to do in my entire life, and that was when you said, I'm going to play a progression, I'm going to make it up as I go, but I'm not going to tell Jerry what it is, and he's going to play with it, And in the process of doing it, because I'd never had that experience before, I didn't have any trouble knowing what he had done and where he was, but what became interesting to me was I realized I'd gotten inside his head to the point where I could kind of figure what he was going to play next before he even got there. So some of them I even dovetailed into the next chain. He hadn't even gotten to it yet.
Yeah.
But I just, like if you hear a half diminished, you expect to hear an altered dominant around the cycle up from that, and that sort of thing. But also, I got a feeling for when he was going to try to throw me a curveball. And maybe one of the funniest curveballs he ever threw me is one day he asked me to come into a master class, and he said, Jerry, why don't you play a ballad for them? I said, oh, great. I love ballads. And I said, which one? And Jamey said, why don't you play Round Midnight? I thought, oh, boy. This last year, I prepared a paper on this for my students, and I had about 4 or 5 different changes for every change in the entire tune, choices you could make. Right. He got to the second change, and did something that wasn't any of those 4 or 5. The only reason I knew where he went, besides, you know, the kind of ear training David was talking about, was that you used a thing like in Sunny.
Oh, yeah.
He used that in the second change, and I'd never heard anybody do that before, but that's what we do with our ears whenever possible, is to make associations. If you don't know what it is, associate it with something that you do know.
Yeah.
And then you know, and then you find yourself already knowing it.
But that's the whole thing that we're trying to teach. Again, there are only so many options.
Right.
And if it isn't one of those, then you've limited what it can be. And you know, to get so you have anticipatory hearing.
Right.
We know, like in language, when we use a certain word, like for instance, I don't know if you know the book by Arthur Kessner called The Act of Creation. And he talks about how we can anticipate what's coming because of the situation. And if it doesn't go there, we know that this is the other option. And you know, it's amazing how quickly, when you've been in the field as long as we have, how quickly we begin to anticipate what's going to happen. Like you said, you're all set up for it to go there, but when it didn't go there, then your ear can make an association and decide where it is going to go. But we all know that if you hear this, it usually does that. That's why it's so valuable having the 2 5s, and they go up by half steps, they go down by half steps. You have them sing where the roots are going, or tritone substitution, or minor third substitution, or turnaround. Because the minute I hear them, we're playing a blues, or we're playing I Got Rhythm. The minute I hear G flat 7 at the beginning of the blues, I know where the rest of it's going because I know that's the cycle. Or if I hear a blues, for instance, and I hear somebody go E minor on the second change of an F major blues, that F major 7th chord tells me that's what's coming next.
Yes.
And so I think that's what...
Well, that's part of it. That's part of it. But some of it is absolutely personal
Of
with
course,
regard to actually getting inside the head of the other person. If you know them well, if you've listened to them, and you know how they think, and it might be different than how anyone else thinks. Like, who was the alto player that came down to Knoxville recently? Kenny Garrett came down, and he played a concert with Donald Brown, and they got into a thing where they were improvising simultaneously. And they were it sounded like it was written out. I mean, it was more than following each other. They were thinking the same things at the same time and doing the same things at the same time. I used to listen to Stan Getz on saxophone. I used to transcribe most everything he did. And I got to where I knew every lick that he played. And then after a certain length of time of doing that, I found him playing things that I had already played. And he didn't know me, he hadn't heard me. So in other words, I'd gotten inside his head to the point where something he hadn't even played yet, I would be able to come up with ahead of that. Or in the analysis of jazz styles class, I tell the students, we got to get inside the heads of these people. Don't just be content with getting the notes and the way they're lined up. There are other things to get, like when Chet Baker is playing on Autumn Leaves and he gets into the second chorus and he plays an E flat against a G minor, and then there's a rest of a beat and a half or two. You know, I say, what happened there? And then finally, after they think about it a while, they say, oh, he forgot the extra 6-bar G minor vamp that they put at the end of the chorus. He momentarily forgot it and went into the C minor, and that's why he played the E flat. The rest that followed the E flat tells you that he knew he made a mistake, because he was an ear player, and he knew it was wrong, you know. But that was like a giveaway, you know, putting the rest in there, and then he quickly recuperated and went on. Hank Mobley got to the end of This I Dig of You, and in his solo toward the end, in the last 16 bars, there's a very noticeable tapering down. I asked the students why. Why did he taper down? They said, well, he's ready to finish the solo. And I said, yes, but why? And then finally somebody says, he's begun to repeat himself. He's begun to play stuff he played prior to that, and like the gentleman that he was, he thought, I got to get out of here. You know, let somebody else play. I'm running out of stuff here. I've reached the bottom of the barrel. It's time to exit.
Well, I'll tell you something scary. I took some lessons with JJ, and we would go to session. About twice this happened. And I remember we would just decide who was going to play, and JJ would play, and he would call tunes, that he knew I was comfortable with as a trombone player. And I never will forget, we're playing the session, and we get out of the head, and I started to play, and JJ put his hand on my arm and pushed it down. He said, "No, Baker, you use up all my stuff when you play first." And I had never thought about it, but again,
yes,
just like with Getz, the person you listen to, in fact, we teach that way. We have people imitate so that they can know what to discuss.
that way.
Thank you.
When we were jamming in Bloomington, when we were all in school at Indiana University, and the people like Wes Montgomery and Slide would come down, instead of taking fours with the drummer, we'd take fours with this guest, it'd be in the basement of some fraternity house, insignificant kind of place. But we were getting a lesson in hearing, because we'd feed something to them, and they'd give it back to us.
Or try to choke us with what they played back.
And make it better, and improve it. And then we found ourselves saying, "Oh yeah, why didn't I think of doing that?" But it's a way of doing things. Or when Slide Hampton and I were playing Giant Steps in Copenhagen, when you had your camp over there, and Slide called up Giant Steps, and I just by accident, I was the first soloist. And when I finished, then Hal Galper took a solo, and Slide standing over there at the side, and he came up next to me and he said, "You sure don't leave a guy much to play." Well, that's the same thing. That's the same thing JJ was telling David, because in those days we actually did that. I mean, for better or for worse. I mean, it was nice that we tallied up things and we knew what had been there and we could invent something new. But of course, in the more mature musical environment, you deliberately do use and reuse substance, that has happened before. If the last guy plays such and such a lick at the end of his solo, you might want to start your solo with that lick and feed on it, like the straight no chaser.
Well, you don't want to do that with Moody, because he gets angry, of course, if you do that.
Right. But we did that when we were in those days. We used to take notice of what everybody had played, so that when it came time for us to play, we didn't want to play any of the same stuff. We wanted to play all new stuff.
That's why it was always better to play first.
Yeah.
Right.
Except then you find yourself saying, "Why didn't I think of that if I had waited?"
I wanted to get back to what you said in the very beginning. You said one of the things you most enjoyed doing was way back there when I just comped and you followed me. Well, nowadays when I do my workshops and things, I've always thought that was the most fun thing to do too. I used to pay Glenn Fisher over in Jeffersonville $6 an hour. This has been a long time ago. He'd come over and play piano for me an hour and a half. We'd play whatever I wanted to play. Play Stella by Starlight in different keys. He would do it. But sometimes we'd spend time doing this. He'd just play 4-bar phrases, 8-bar phrases, and I'd just follow him. And that's the most fun I ever had, because I never know where he's going. And when you come out and you hit like you're on the fourth of a minor or the fourth of a half diminished, and you're sitting there and you didn't know if you were going to go off the cliff or if it was going to be beautiful,
Right.
But you're willing to take those chances. And I often say to people when I'm doing my clinics, I say, now, this is what young people need to do. Yes. The parents want the kids to play music. You're not getting on that school bus. Come on, we got to go. The mother sits down and plays cards on the piano, and the kid gets the clarinet out. It's always ready to go, and they play. Can't get on the school bus until we've done our ear training this morning. Where's the music? There is no music. Use your ear and just play. Might be just one scale, and after you do that for a month, then she can start to move around a little bit. Everybody who wants to be a musician needs a mother or a father or a brother or a sister to sit down and comp slowly for them like that and develop that ear. Yeah. Wouldn't that be something?
The best example of it is what happens with Miles and Herbie. Miles could play the worst note in the world, and it always sounded right because Herbie would react to it. And I think that's why Miles didn't want to rehearse. He wanted to be always the point where he's out there in deep water. And whatever he played, it sounded beautiful because Herbie would anticipate where he was going, or the minute he heard it, it was fixed before. Starker used to say, nobody plays in tune. He would say, what happens is the great players fix it before it gets to your ear.
Right.
And that's, I think, what we do in jazz.
Jim McNeely used to do that at Jamey's camps on Friday when the faculty rhythm section would be playing for what you referred to earlier as the Lizards. but the weakest of the students, because they had to perform too. They had to play, no matter how little background they might have had. And so I'd watch McNeely up there, and if the student played a really bad note,
the major third on the minor chord,
he'd move things around until it sounded right, you know. And it was so compassionate, you know. It's a nice thing to do.
I wanted to tell a quick story. You mentioned Chet Baker. Pat LaBarbera, the tenor player, he said that he worked a night or 2 or 3 with Chet Baker. And at one point, Chet says, let's do Stella by Starlight. Pat says, okay, fine. And Chet says, what key do I do that in? And Pat says, well, I don't know. You know, he hadn't played with him. He didn't know. So they dove into the tune. They got into it just a little bit. And Chet takes his trumpet off his mouth and he says to Pat, this ain't the key. But yet you'd never know he wasn't in the key.
Right, right.
He's working it out on the spot, but he's letting Pat know this isn't the key I usually play it in, but the audience would probably never know.
Well, I had an experience with Chet about that very thing during the time I was playing with Woody, and we were in New York, and he invited me up to his hotel room. We talked for a while, and I happened to mention to him that sometimes on trips in the car or something, I'll find my fingers subconsciously moving. I'm not aware of it, but I'm hearing pitches as it's going on, and then I suddenly say, oh, I'm practicing, and I'm hearing the notes I would play. Chet leaned over and said, you do that too? He said, he said, I'll be sitting in a movie. And he said, and I'll suddenly become aware that I'm moving my fingers like I'm fingering trumpet, and I'm hearing the pitches as they go.
I use that as a teaching tool. I say, never sing in this class, in the improvisation class, without fingering the instrument. I said, and you know, the beautiful thing is, I don't know it on saxophone, but on trombone or trumpet, I can tell if they're playing a D, or they're playing an E flat, or whatever. I said, so if you don't want me to jump all over your case for not playing what you're hearing, or what we're supposed to be playing, I said, then you sit somewhere where I can't see your hands. Because if I can see you. And unfortunately, the only note I know on the saxophone is B flat, 1 and 1. If they miss that one, I got them.
Oh.
That reminds me of a phenomenon I experience a lot, and I'm wondering if it's common for you. Almost inevitably, whenever I hear music on the radio or on a CD or something, I'm mentally transcribing it. And either I see the music in front of me or I feel it in my fingers, and I cannot turn that off. It's impossible for me to have a meeting with somebody when there's music on in the background, because there's this track that's always, you know. So the same thing happens to you.
I think it happens at varying degrees. There are times when it's, you know, strictly leisurely listening. I may not respond that way, but another time I'm listening and immediately I'm reacting to it. Not only that, but you know, my wife and I travel a lot, and when we're listening to classical music, a piece we've never heard before, we immediately, at 2 or 3 minutes, you say, it's got to be Brahms. It has to be Brahms. Well, how do you know? We haven't analyzed it, but if we go back and analyze it, we understand that's the way he wrote for this, for the woodwind, this is the way he wrote for the string. And I think you do that, and that's the advantage of getting the students to listen, because it's amazing how much they pick up just listen. And you know, as kids, you know, we have a canon, even though we don't wish to talk about it all the time, a canon of things that we think they ought to know. And I'm surprised when I ask kids, and these are kids who come out of very, very good high schools, or even are working on a master's degree, and they have never heard. I said, who ends the solo, the trumpet solo like this? Do-do-do-do-do-do-da. And they don't have any notion what I'm talking about. That's why I used to love to play the game with Patty, when we would talk about, you sing the words, I'll give you the next line of the words, or we would do it with like, you sing a phrase in a solo, and I'm going to sing the next phrase, or you sing the next phrase, because that's what we should know, just like we know a book when we say, call me Ishmael. What book are we talking about? We're supposed to know that, or in the beginning. We hope we did know that.
I heard that you also did that with tunes, with standards and things up at IU.
Yeah, we would play the beginning of the solo, or play in the middle. Sing the next phrase. Beep, beep, boop, up, up.
You need to be able to do that, because sometimes our subconscious memory pulls things in little teeny pieces.
Oh, yes.
And until we can get the continuum, go on past that point, we might not be able to think of what the tune is. Like I had one going through my head yesterday, driving up here. Do, 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 do. And I thought, what is that? What is that? And then as I followed it through, I realized it was estate, but I had to follow it through first, you know, because we get them in these little fragments. But your business of hearing and transcribing automatically is an absolute necessity for teaching improvisation.
And for surviving as an improviser.
Because otherwise, a student plays something and you hear a couple of bad notes, sour notes or whatever, and say, oh, that sounded awful. Well, that's not helping him. You got to be specific.
Yeah.
You need to be able to say, oh, you played a such and such and you should have been playing a such and such.
Something that's obvious through the conversation here is all of you are advocating this kind of total immersion in the auditory experience of the music as a foundation for being able to express it. Just like you, if you want to speak German fluently, you immerse yourself in the sounds of German.
Oh, you'd have to, because as David was saying earlier, we kind of slid over the point, but I know he feels more deeply about it, that you can teach a student all the theoretical substance, but if they're not really hearing it, and if they haven't been hearing the music on record, like Jamey was talking about, then you come out with this very mechanical solo that has no real feeling behind it. There's no heart, you know. So yes, the hearing is the foundation for the whole thing.
But even more than that,
what we teach through theory is just to speed the process up for the ears.
Exactly.
But everything we learn in theory should be returned to the ears, and the ears will tell you when they have it. You'll suddenly start to think about something intellectually, and the ears will say, hey, don't bother me with that, I've got it, I'll take it over from here. And they will.
But memory is so important. It's the only one of the arts where you can only make sense of it if you can remember what has been. And I watched all three of us when we're teaching, and we hear four soloists, and you have to go back and remember what the first soloist did. And you say, no, please don't play a flat 6 on that scale.
Right.
Because that's
a Dorian,
but it's memory again.
Right.
And you know, I think we can sing whole solos.
Yes.
Because that's part of the memory bank. And I think that's one of the most valuable things we have, even after we know all this stuff.
I think that something they should do in this scientific age is they ought to take people like us and then people that play for a living, you know, all the time, jazz musicians, older people, and check out their brains. You know, they're doing all these scopes and MRIs and stuff, but they need to check us out for memory and this, that, and the other, because I think the jazz musicians... Is it all right if we die first? Huh? Is it all right if we die first? No, you don't want to die first. We want you hooked up to the machine while it's doing. You know, I see tests every now and then, you know, like a paragraph in the newspaper or something, but they're always using classical music or they're using folk music or something to prove a point or to learn something. I think they ought to get the jazz musicians, because especially nowadays. In the old days, you would have had the jazz musician that didn't know anything about the theory. The left brain wasn't hooked up. It was all the right side. They're playing by imitation and memory and this, that, and the other. And they might be playing with drugs and so forth in their veins and who knows what else. But nowadays, you got a completely different jazz musician. They're holistic. They're using both sides of their brain. They can't wait to play. They're teaching people how to play. They're taking money for jobs. They're doing the whole ball of wax. And I think there's something to be learned there. I mean, all these tests that these companies like Yamaha and Summer that they run to encourage people to have music in schools and to not cut it out, they say that if the kid starts playing music at an early age, it's going to help everything they do. Now, why they continue to cut it out is beyond me, if it proves this point. But when you move that next step into improvisation, that's when I think it gets really interesting. That's when you might be able to really help mankind in general.
Well, Alec Wilder, remember that saying that he has in his book, The Popular Music? He says, how does an improviser, he says, how the hell does a mind work that fast? To interpret information, recycle it, and play, to leaf through 25 ideas in a split second to come up with the right one. But if somebody could really trace the brain waves.
Well, I think they ought to do that. Somebody ought to do it. Maybe somebody at U of L will do that. I don't know what you need to do it. But we can certainly do things to look for.
Well, we'll set up a conversation with some folks at the medical school.
I do think that it is significant that you mention, you know, what's happening in education. I don't want to get into how it is failing our children. That's become rather obvious to everybody. But I've always felt that music is of the divine. I've always felt like it's somewhere between here and heaven, and cannot be put in the same terms, because it's a personal kind of expression and creativity that goes beyond the charts, any charting that you could possibly do to explain it. And I think it's where most of us are supposed to be dwelling and have a hard time doing it, because we live in a society that generally has little creativity about it, and we're not asking for it. There are an awful lot of copycats out there. Charlie Mingus said, you know, Bird had been a gunslinger, there'd be a whole lot of dead copycats. Well, that was healthy copying, because at least they were copying a creative model.
Yes.
But it's a fright to me that in education, that the very thing that might place the students in a whole nother plane, one between here and heaven, is being taken away, and trying to supplant it with the humanism kinds of courses and things.
Well, that's why it's valuable, while you're doing what you're doing now, and why we have to make sure that we never dismiss that.
We'll be back in just a moment, exploring more about the lessons that jazz has for us in the living of a worthy life. You know, it's interesting, when I went through this poisoning, this mold thing, I actually had some neurological damage that was in one part of my brain quite...
It in, but when he was arranging it at the piano, it would be in C,
That would
because he had total
cripple me,
control
man.
over that
Boy,
key. You know.
that would cripple me. Well,
Me
of course,
too.
people who grew up in Logansport, that's probably what was happening.
Ready?
'Cause-
Isn't that where the sanitarium is?
yes, and that's also where he's from.
Okay.
I'm Harry Pickens here with David Baker, Jerry Coker, and Jamey Aebersold. We've been talking about jazz, jazz education, history of jazz, where it might be going. We're going to spend just a few minutes now talking about the lessons in life that one learns being a jazz musician, because jazz is a unique art form. It combines composition and improvisation. The right and the left hand of the... Start over. Sorry. I'm just going to keep going. I'm here with...
He's bragging back. Hold on.
Okay, cool.
Okay, we're rolling.
This is Harry Pickens. I'm here with David Baker, Jerry Coker, Jamey Aebersold. We've been talking about all aspects of jazz and jazz education and jazz improvisation. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the lessons that jazz has for our living a more effective and powerful life. Jazz combines lots of things: left brain, the right brain, improvisation, composition, preparation, spontaneity. So what are some of the lessons that you've learned about life itself through exploring this music called jazz?
Life isn't long enough for what I have to learn.
I think that goes for all of us.
Mercy, mercy, mercy. It becomes more precious as you get older, isn't it? Especially if you're still playing, like all of us are still playing. David's playing cello, you're playing tenor, I'm playing alto, and we can't wait. You're playing piano, and we can't wait to play together tonight. Boy, you just don't want it to end. It does seem kind of strange, isn't it, that we spend all this time, and thousands of other musicians do too, to get their art to a stage where they feel good about it and they can express themselves without having given so much thought, and then you die.
Well, and most of the best players that we've known never did feel like they had the whole thing covered yet. I mean, somebody like Michael Brecker, you know, will just blow you away when you hear him play, but if you hear him talk about himself, he's never satisfied. I don't think John Coltrane was satisfied with his playing. I don't think Charlie Parker was satisfied with it. He was searching for other things at the time he died.
Something I tell students is an insight that I had, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. And I say this insight will either drive you crazy or make you sane. And it's the realization that jazz, uniquely and as a musical art form, you're never finished.
No.
You're never finished. I mean, it's theoretically possible to learn all the works of Chopin or of Bach if you're a pianist or something and feel like, okay, I'm done with that. But with jazz, you're as good as your next solo. And there's always more. And it's the more you learn, the older you get, the more vistas open out before you.
Well, I'm not sure to whom to attribute this, but somebody said once before that it isn't the destination, it's the journey that's exciting. It's the journey that makes it worthwhile. The striving always toward a goal that's unattainable. Perfection is not achievable in any field. But in jazz, where the ground keeps shifting, you move into a different period, there are other things to learn there. Every time you open the door, there's another door behind it. But I think what it does is it equips us to deal with, you know, the daily problems that we encounter, because as improvisers, we're forever coming to a point in the road where we can go left or right. And then having to figure in a split second, you know, particularly if it's a life and death situation, you're driving, or something happens and that could really mean being maimed for life or something, and you have to make a split second decision. I would trust a jazz musician quicker than I would almost anybody else to make that decision and make the right one.
Interesting. Jamey, you were talking about how interesting it would be to have scientists explore the brains of improvisers in that moment. Talk more about that. What do you think's going on at that time that's so unique?
I don't know. I just, as I see people, and since I know quite a bit about improvising, and I hear people improvising, and my ears, I've worked on them, I've got them to the stage where I can hear what's going on without having to write the music down or have someone else write in front of me, and I know the interaction and the spontaneity that goes on. There's got to be stuff going on there that we use in our everyday life. Like David says, if there's a life-threatening situation, let me be in the hands of a jazzer, you know, because they're used to improvising and they know how to get out of situations. I just think there would be a lot there, maybe for the whole world to learn, but also for people that teach music. I think a lot of your regular band directors and so forth, your choral directors and so forth, they have a lesson plan and so forth, things that they want to accomplish. And if a certain person doesn't show up, or if a group doesn't show up, they don't know how to adjust. I can remember way back there at Indiana University, one of the first things I learned to adjust was, we try to have a jam session. You know, as a freshman, you can't get a lot of people together to jam. And the bass player would never show up. We couldn't play. And finally, this happened 3 or 4 times, and finally we got over to somebody's house and the bass player didn't show. Or it was the drummer, I think it was the drummer. So we went ahead and played. Keyboard, bass, and myself. And all of a sudden, the light came on. Ah, man, this is what Sonny Rollins and Coltrane and these people have done. They've played without the drums, or they've played without the keyboard or the guitar, and man, that's why they're so strong. They can hear that harmony without that fountain, or they can hear the time without the drummer. That was the last time I ever thought that we had to have a set group of musicians. Now, I think in the educational settings, in your band rooms, your jazz rooms and so forth, I think most people feel they have to have a certain thing, and if the bass player doesn't show up, they're really upset at the bass player. I've learned to just go right ahead. We're going to make this sucker swing. If we got 2 people here, we're going to swing. If we got 40, we're going to swing. That's what we're going to do. So I think exploring a person's brain would be really interesting. And I think if that were ever going to happen, you'd need people like us and probably other people to feed in questions that we're going to ask and things that we're going to analyze and look for while we do this. Or we may look at it all wrong, because we're looking at it from an improviser's standpoint, and that's different. The average person wants security. And we want security in certain things, that's for sure, you know. If I make my oatmeal, I want to make sure there's a little sugar in the bowl that I can put on it, you know, things like that. But when it comes over to this other area, I think we've learned how to improvise in a lot of situations where the average person panics.
Well, you know, it's interesting. There's a quote by, I believe it's Eric Hoffer. He says, in times of turbulent change, it's the learners that inherit the future. You know, and you talked about the journey and destination. It seems like jazz is all journey. That's what it's about. It's about learning to live in the journey and learning to make those choices and learning to be authentic and learning to be adaptable and flexible and learning to be a learner in every moment. You know, so just by the process of improvising, I know I've done a lot of work with outside the music area, facilitating teams and that sort of thing. And it's always been really easy for me to work with people who were really different and bring them to some kind of common unity. And it's also all very easy for me to scrap the plans and start over if I have to. And I've noticed working with other people, some people completely freak out when it's not according to agenda. And I just realized, had a blinding flash of the obvious, that a lot of that has to do with having been an improvising musician and learning, like you said, to make those changes.
You were asking about relating it to life. I'm spending more and more of my time reading scripture and studying it very carefully the way I would, you know, many, many other subjects of the past, and I am constantly reminded of the parallels between what we do as jazz musicians and what we would do as spiritual entities. Because when you think about it, if you're going to be a jazz improviser, you have to have a high degree of compassion, a feeling of brotherhood, an understanding of being able to put your mind and heart on a higher plane than the mundanities of life, and yet the mundanities of life become easier to deal with because, well, I remember when Jamey used to come up to me sometimes at the camps, and I'd come up to him and I'd say, Jamey, we got a problem here. What are we going to do? And Jamey would say, improvise. and as soon as he said it, I thought, yeah, right, of course. We just need to creatively solve the problem and get to it. So that we're so used to doing that, solving problems all the time, and as teachers, that even emphasizes it, that life's problems begin to be like that to us. We begin to see that, you know, we need to make decisions, we need to make choices, we need to know when to turn off the television set, we need to know when to get away from that computer, and the things that seem to be trying to drive our lives in a particular direction, and always be conscious, you know, this is a choice. I don't have to stay here, I don't have to be led around by this electronic device. I know where I want to go. And it'd be the same thing with us in jazz, that if we aren't listening to the right things, aren't responding to them properly, and aren't paying attention to what the other people in the group are playing, then it's not going to be as a workable an experience.
So we did an interesting thing at the White House about 3 or 4 years ago called Jazz as a Metaphor for Democracy. Democracy is best demonstrated by jazz, where, as Paul Berliner says in his book, where you're the leader when you're the solo. Now you recede into the background and you have to be the accompaniment, the supporter of the leader. And it keeps changing leaders, and every time the leader changes, the new soloist, you have to make adjustments, whether you're the piano player or the bass player or the and in the best of those situations, it's those times when that happens. It's like listening to Bill Evans when he had Scotty LaFaro. It was almost impossible to even talk about who was the leader of that group.
Right.
Because the interaction was at such a deep level. It's like you were pointing out with Stan Getz. Now, who's leading it and who's not leading when the solo. And it seems to me that that's the lesson we learn from the Bible. I think it's a lesson we learn in all those things that speak to the best of the species. You know, the fact that we live in a world where we're not always the center of the universe. We've all experienced the times when all of a sudden we're in a situation where we are well known in what we do, and we're in a situation where nobody knows who we are. We were at a conference when I was on the National Council, and Cannonball was there, and everybody knew Cannonball. But he was introduced to this lady, and she says, "And tell me, sir, what is it that you do?" And Cannon was crushed. And it's always making that adjustment to the fact that we're not always the center of the universe. And it seems to me if there's a lesson that the Bible teaches us, it is that humility. It is that ability to realize, what is it, the golden rule, do unto others. And when we put in a situation where we forget that, like I think Jamey says, where all of a sudden we don't have the drummer, now we're more dependent on those people that are around us, and they're more dependent on us. And we have to be there, and our ego has to be sublimated enough that we can step back and just provide support. And I think it's important that, you know, I think this is something as teachers we do, because it's like Natty Boulanger used to ask of her students when they would come, whether it was Quincy Jones or whether it was Aaron Copland or whoever. She would ask them the question, why do you want to be a composer? And the only answer acceptable was her, it's not that I want to be a composer, I have to be a composer. And for us, I think we have to be teachers, whether we say it that way or not. I think anybody who knows us in that capacity.
That's interesting. As I was listening to all of you speak, you've all had tremendously distinctive and influential careers. You've touched the lives directly and indirectly of millions of people. I'm one of them through your publications and the play-alongs and our personal interaction. And at this point in your lives, what is it that drives you forward, that keeps you engaged with people of all ages, all cultures, all types, all backgrounds? What is it that continues to propel you forward, even at this stage in your life, when there's so much that you've experienced in the past and you've been so influential? Just go around.
I find it's not repetitive. As every single individual I've ever taught is different. I think every interaction with every human being is also different. So I don't find that. In fact, if anything is keeping me alive in the heart, it is the music. It is jazz. It's larger than all of us, and it is so exciting to be a part of it, whether you're a teacher or a player or what you're writing about it or what you're doing with it, that it propels itself. And it is ever changing. David pointed that out. He talked about the shifting ground, you know, that's going on in jazz. There's always something different. It's not a stable target. It's a moving target. And it's one that you're never going to really hit exactly, you know. But that's what makes it exciting. That's why I can't understand why anybody would not want to be a jazz musician. Wow.
That's true. You mentioned something earlier. A prisoner once wrote me and said, "Your problem is your best friend. Hang out with him more often."
That's a great way to think about it.
Your problem is your best friend. Hang out with him more often. And I use that in my teaching, and I also think about it myself when we run into these brick walls. You know, an obstacle is an opportunity in disguise, yes. You know.
Well, for me, that's the way I think about it. You know, anytime I have I interface with a student or anybody else, if I don't come away having learned something, then I'm disappointed. I'll tell you, somebody asked me once why I write little tiny things on the board. I said, well, that's when I say something I didn't know that I knew. You know, because it very much happens that whole business of you just want to know everything, and you know you can't know everything. You open the door, and we can read as much as we want to, we can teach as much as we want to, but it is still the thrill of encountering a problem. As a composer, for instance, I find I'm my most effective the more constraints you put on what I do. Every time you close a door, you tell me it's a piece of music, now it's wide open. You say, well, I want it to be 3 movements long, fast, slow, fast, or slow, fast, slow, whatever. Now it's for clarinet. I don't want to, this is all the range that I've got. Every time you give me another constraint, it's that what you were talking about. You close the door, if you see it as an opportunity, and maybe that's why we know that there's no way we reach nirvana. We can keep on trucking as long as we want to.
What is the saying? When one door is closed,
another door opens. Yes, and I think maybe it is that I know I can speak for myself. I can't imagine a life without this music, and maybe the reason is that I'm so hungry to know everything I can. I can't tell you how much I'm going to take away from this session today that will turn into teaching techniques, will turn into things that make my life better.
And I know no one I know works as hard as David does at trying to know it all, you know? Yeah. And so if he says it's not attainable, then you better believe it.
You know, another thing, Harry, too, just the fact that we're sitting here talking and we all still play and we love to play and we've listened. This is completely opposite than what it would be 50 years ago. You know, 1950, you couldn't get 3 jazz musicians, I don't think, to sit down and talk like this, because somebody would say right off the bat, well, even before you got together, they'd say, what are you going to talk about? Jazz is music, you know? And there was this underlying feeling, and if you talk about it, it's going to ruin it. And then, like somebody said earlier, if you can hear it, you can have it, but I ain't going to give it to you with words and books and sentences and so forth, you know? That somehow tarnishes this. That's the mystique, I think, that has been there for so long. And the jazz musicians were probably responsible for keeping that mystique going. I think the 3 of us, plus hundreds of others, have tried to break that down. You know, gently break it down and allow people to have fun playing music, play Happy Birthday, play Row, Row, Row Your Boat, play one chorus of the blues scale, and go eat supper and feel good. Man, that's what it's all about.
There was a very extensive history of jazz segment that I won't mention by name, but I'm sure we know what it is, that missed the boat largely because of its unyielding emphasis on the sociology that surrounded jazz from the beginning to the present day. And it ruined it. It ruined the effect of it, of what we were supposed to get out of it. And it reminded me of the conversation when Archie Shepp and Roland Kirk and a couple of other musicians have been gathered for a Downbeat interview. And Archie Shepp and the others immediately began talking about racism, and it just was unyielding. And finally, Rashawn Roland Kirk, who hadn't said a word up to that time, said, "Hey, what's going on? I thought we came here to talk about jazz." You know, and that's sort of what Jamey's talking about. You know, I mean, it's that thing that it's a prevalent kind of sociological thing that gets into an area where it doesn't belong. I think jazz is more pure than that. I don't think it has color about it, and I don't think it has the withholding of information attached to it.
Well, it doesn't have any more. You know,
David said it's the most democratic
yeah, it doesn't have any more. There are probably still people around that wish it weren't that way. Because they'd like to be the head hog, so to speak, you know. But it's not that way anymore, I don't think.
Well, it's funny when Harry mentioned how it has affected your life as a musician. My first thought on reaction to that, it wasn't the way we approached it, but my first thought was, does he mean in professional music? Because the professional side of it is the part that is the most difficult for me to tolerate. Because it does have a dog-eat-dog competitive atmosphere. Who's got the best agent? Who's got the longest newsletter? And push. Self-promotional kind of thing is the way it has turned. And I find that part of it to be ugly. I find it to be unfortunate. I still like the purity that is around the jazz that I grew up with and have always known.
Well, the ego, I've always felt, is the biggest deterrent to learning. And you have to fight it. You know, when I go out to do my walk in the morning, I find myself being envious of something or somebody, I have to say, get away, let me alone, get out of my thoughts. And it's very difficult because as human beings, we have the frailties of all human beings. As we're taught in the Bible, none of us is going to get to heaven on the strength of what we do and what we say. We come by faith. And by faith, it means we have to try to do the good things that we do. Right. And I think teaching and sharing this information is something that has been a thing that has welded our friendship in a way that probably nothing else could have done. We come from different, desperate backgrounds. JC and I probably have known each other, well, since 1950 or 1951. Jamey and I almost that long. But our friendship is welded around our love for the music and the love for teaching the music. And we're aware when once in a while we get slighted or somebody does something that, isn't about attribution or whatever. But we've learned to forget that kind of thing because it really is about sharing. And I think that's what we've been able to do and love to do better than anybody else, because we can get mad at each other. We can fight. We're family. But when it gets down to it, the love that we have as the central part of our life, that doesn't change.
And it seems that the three of you and the generation and evolution of jazz education that you represent have really bridged jazz first century and the beginnings of its second century as we enter into the 21st century. And the cultural and social milieu that jazz originated in has transformed itself. The styles of music that were associated with jazz at the beginning of the 20th century have changed. The background of the individual who is attracted to the music is much broader than it's ever been. There are people in every country in the world playing music. As a jazz musician, I talk about the practical aspects of being a jazz musician because you can drop me off a plane on any place in the world and I can communicate with whoever's there musically. You can't say that about somebody who maybe grew up playing violin in a symphony orchestra or something. I'm curious from your standpoint, and we're kind of winding our time down here, what do you see the direction of jazz in its second century? What do you see occurring in the future of jazz? And what do you hope to see occurring in the second century of this music?
Well, we might want to start with what one of my teachers at Yale told me one time. He said, anyone who tries to tell you what the music of the future is going to be is a fool. And Bernard Haydn said essentially the same thing also. So for starters, I'm sure we'd all have to admit we don't know.
Of course.
You know, until we get there.
If I were going to say anything...
And if we did know, we probably wouldn't still be interested in the music.
No, that's for sure. But what I would love to see, if anything, I would like to see education broaden its tentacles in such a way that everybody has some experience with everybody can improvise. Everybody should know about the history and about the legacy of this music. And I think that by and large, that's not the case. I don't care that we talk about the fact that we've got 8,000 members and we're 42 countries. That's infinitesimal.
You're referring to IAG.
Yeah, I was going to say.
It's not big enough. It's not nearly big enough. There are kids who come all the way through a school system in the United States of America, in a major city, without any contact with this music or the business of improvisation as a part of their regular life and their cultural being. And I think that I would hope that that's going to be one of the things that will change in this new millennium.
And this is the president talking.
Exactly. President of International Association of Jazz Educators, David. He was the president starting July the 1st of this year, 2002, and he'll be the president for 2 years.
And I read the stuff you had outlined that you wanted to accomplish, and it looks ambitious, but they're all good ideas, and I hope you're able to, get some gears going.
Well, that's what they say, the longest journey starts with a single step.
That's
and
right.
I'm not so naive as to think all that's going to get accomplished, but I do think that, we stand as maybe the last bastion to the idiocy that seems to permeate the globe right now.
Yeah.
I can remember back in in the 60s, David, over in Illinois at DeKalb or somewhere, and it was a big band camp, and you were there, and you were talking about how in time we'd put ourselves out of business as a jazz educator because we would teach everybody how to improvise, they would teach other people, and everybody would be improvising. There wouldn't be any need for summer jazz workshops, for instance. And I really thought that would happen. It didn't happen at all. And I think the problem is the fact that this idea that you're either born with it or you're not to improvise is still extremely prevalent in higher education. They don't insist that people that are going to be music educators, for instance, take an improv class or take a music pedagogy class or a methods class. The guy graduates after 4 or 5 years of college, gets his band degree, goes to some town, and next thing you know, he finds out he's got a jazz band. They've always had a jazz band, and he knows absolutely positively nothing about how to rehearse a jazz band. I think that's criminal myself. And if I were those people, I'd say, man, I want a refund from the university so I can go to a summer camp and learn how to do this, But I don't see it happening but now we've got Willie Hill now, who's in charge of MENC, and David's in charge of IAJE. Maybe here in the next year or two, we can make a little inroad. This is a big opportunity, I feel, for jazz education. And for all these people who don't know anything about jazz who are going to be coming up as youngsters.
Well, there are people already very angry. The article from the president's message next time, the title is, one course won't cut it. And I really believe very firmly that until it becomes a part of the system, that we really revere this music the same way we revere the music of Beethoven, Bach, and Brahms. We don't even talk about American popular music. People don't know who Cole Porter is. They don't know who Jerome Kern is. They don't know about George Gershwin. How can you do that in a country where the music was born? And certainly jazz. Can you imagine somebody in Prague talking about Czechoslovakian music without talking about the composers who made Czechoslovakian music what it is?
Of course.
I can't imagine that. Yes, we do that on a daily basis. And perhaps you're right. I hope that maybe some kind of alliance with Willie Hill and the MENC, which acts as basically as the arbiter of what is good in music, will, a reconciliation. I'm not sure about that.
Something that I've been doing, I just happened to think of it. In the spring of the year, I played about 30 school concerts, jazz, 45-minute programs, trumpet, alto, piano, bass, and drums, upright bass, and acoustic piano whenever available. The kids love it. The kids tap their feet on, and they snap their fingers on 2 and 4 without being told to do so. I know they've never heard this music before. So I reached well over 5,000 kids. We started again this fall. I just played down in Corden, Indiana, 2 concerts the other day, 200 kids at each thing. They're listening and watching. They don't know anything about the music, but they're intrigued. We have no music. I tell them what's going on. The foundation is the bass and the piano and this, that, and the other. And they're watching. And I'm thinking, now if they just had a class that spent 3 weeks, you know, on this type of music, and the guy played records and knew, and maybe had somebody come into the classroom instead of being in the auditorium, those people could learn a lot about music. And if they were musicians, they might want to try to improvise. As a matter of fact, at Corden, they don't have a jazz band. I didn't bother to ask why. They've got 2 choirs, they've got a concert band, they've got a marching band, no jazz band. That's just one school. Yeah. It's a pretty good sized town, you know. But I feel like playing for people is a great thing, but then there needs to be that follow-up in order for any kind of continuance to happen. That's what I'd like to see. I'm sorry to say I don't see it happening.
A department chairman at the University of Tennessee, who isn't there anymore, but when he was, it gave us an inside track on knowing what MENC and NASM were up to, the National Association of Schools of Music, because he served on their board. He went out to schools to accredit or not accredit schools of music, etc. And so he was on top of the latest things that they were talking about. And he told us, and this has now been 5 or 10 years ago, he said, there is a time coming very shortly now when NASM will declare that all music students, regardless of style, will have to have a segment of improvisation. Doesn't have to be jazz improvisation, but improvisation. And I thought, my, what a giant step forward that would be if, you know, if the violinist of an orchestra had to learn how to improvise within their style.
We're just about out of time, gentlemen, but I wanted to just kind of summarize by saying, you know, if jazz is the journey, you are certainly part of the people who are keeping that journey alive. And I also hope for a world in which everyone will improvise. So thank you, David Baker, Jerry Coker, Jamey Aebersold.
Thank you.
Thank you.
They gave us a signal that the tape was running out.
Well, you know what, man, one thing that always impressed me, Mr. Brown, my band teacher, used to say, he would say that learning doesn't take